As the group began to disperse, Admiral Chen approached Jake directly. "Lieutenant Commander, I wonder if you might have a few minutes for a private conversation. I'd like to get your perspective on some operational matters." Jake glanced at Captain Williams, who nodded his approval. "Certainly, Admiral. Would you prefer to use one of the briefing rooms?" "Actually, if you don't mind, I'd rather talk somewhere less formal. Perhaps we could walk on deck while there's still some daylight." This was definitely not typical Admiral behavior, Jake thought. Most high-ranking officers preferred the comfort and status symbols of official meeting spaces. But he nodded his agreement, and they made their way to one of the ship's observation decks. The Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface painted with the colors of approaching sunset. Admiral Chen stood at the railing for a moment, seeming to appreciate the view before turning her attention to Jake. "I wanted to talk to you away from the formal setting because I'm interested in your honest assessment of some things," she began. "Not the kind of answers you'd give in an official briefing, but your real thoughts." Jake studied her face, trying to read her intentions. "What kind of assessment, ma'am?" "The current state of special operations training, for one thing, the equipment and resources available to teams like yours, the level of support you receive from command structure." She paused. "And whether you feel like the people making strategic decisions really understand what you and your teams face in the field." The last question hit close to home for Jake. It was exactly the kind of concern he had been discussing with his team for years, but not something he would normally share with a visiting admiral. The directness of the question suggested either remarkable honesty or a very sophisticated trap. "Admiral, that's a pretty loaded question," Jake said carefully. "I know it is, and I know you have no reason to trust me with a completely honest answer, but I'm asking because I genuinely want to understand the perspective from your level." She turned to face him fully. "How long has it been since you felt like a senior officer really understood the challenges your team faces?" Jake felt his carefully maintained professional facade beginning to crack. The question touched on years of frustration with commanders who treated special operations like a video game, making decisions based on theoretical scenarios rather than battlefield realities. "Admiral, with all due respect, that's exactly the kind of question that makes me nervous. In my experience, when senior officers start asking about honest feedback, it usually means someone's about to get in trouble for giving it." Admiral Chen smiled, and for the first time it looked completely genuine rather than diplomatically appropriate. "Fair enough. You have good reason to be cautious." She was quiet for a moment, watching the waves. "Let me ask you something else. Have you ever worked with someone who had been through BUDS training?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Jake wasn't sure why Admiral Chen would be asking about Navy SEAL basic training. "Ma'am, my entire team has been through BUDS. That's a requirement for SEAL qualification." "I know that. I meant someone who had been through the training but wasn't currently serving as a SEAL. Maybe someone who had moved into a different role within the military." Jake thought for a moment. "I've worked with a few former SEALs who moved into intelligence or administrative positions." "Why do you ask?" Admiral Chen seemed to be weighing her words carefully. "I'm curious about whether you think that kind of background, actual operational experience, makes a difference in how someone approaches strategic planning and decision-making."
"Absolutely it does," Jake replied without hesitation.
"There's a huge difference between someone who has been shot at and someone who has only read reports about people being shot at. The decisions are completely different when you understand what it actually feels like to have your life depend on the quality of your equipment and training." "That's what I thought," Admiral Chen said quietly. "And how do you usually react when you discover that someone in authority actually has that kind of background?" Jake was becoming increasingly puzzled by the direction of the conversation. "I guess I'm usually pretty relieved. It's rare to find senior officers who really understand operational realities." Admiral Chen nodded slowly. "I imagine it is." She seemed to be building up to something, but Jake couldn't figure out what. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young ensign who approached them somewhat nervously. "Excuse me, Admiral. Captain Williams asked me to inform you that your quarters are ready and your evening briefing materials have been delivered." "Thank you, Ensign," Admiral Chen replied. "Please tell the captain I'll be along shortly." As the ensign departed, Admiral Chen turned back to Jake. Lieutenant Commander, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me. I know these inspections can feel intrusive, but I really am trying to get a better understanding of how things work at the operational level. Of course, ma'am, if there's anything else you'd like to know about our unit's capabilities or training, I'm happy to provide whatever information would be helpful. Admiral Chen extended her hand for a farewell handshake. I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to talk tomorrow. I'm particularly interested in observing that live fire exercise you mentioned. As she walked away, Jake found himself more confused than ever about Admiral Chen. The conversation had been unlike any he had ever had with a senior officer. Her question suggested a level of understanding that seemed inconsistent with the typical career path of someone who had reached admiral rank at such a young age. Jake remained on deck for a while longer, watching the sun disappear into the Pacific horizon. Something about Admiral Chen nagged at him, a sense of familiarity that he couldn't quite place. Her manner of speaking, the way she asked questions, even her body language seemed to suggest experiences that didn't match his expectations of a fast-tracked political appointee. When he finally returned to his quarters, Jake found Martinez waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a curious expression. "So what did you think of the private audience with Admiral Chen?" Martinez asked. Jake shook his head. "I don't know what to think. She asked some pretty direct questions about command structure and whether senior officers understand operational realities." "That doesn't sound like typical Admiral conversation." "No, it doesn't. And there was something else weird. She kept asking about people who had operational experience but moved into other roles, like she was fishing for something specific." Martinez raised an eyebrow. Maybe she's trying to figure out if there are any problems with the command structure that she should know about. "Maybe," Jake said, though he wasn't convinced that explained the strange direction of their conversation. "Or maybe she's exactly what I thought she was. Another political appointee trying to look like she understands the military." "You're still skeptical?" Jake nodded. "Until I see some real evidence that she knows what she's talking about, I'm going to assume she's just another suit with fancy rank insignia." That night, as Jake lay in his narrow bunk listening to the familiar sounds of the ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important about Admiral Chen. Her questions had been too specific, too focused on operational details that political appointees usually didn't care about. But he had learned long ago not to get his hopes up about senior officers. Tomorrow's live fire exercise would be telling. If Admiral Chen really wanted to observe their training, she would get a first-hand look at what Navy SEALs actually did. And if she was just another administrator playing military dress-up, that would become obvious pretty quickly when the bullets started flying downrange. Jake closed his eyes and tried to get some sleep, but his mind kept returning to the conversation on deck. Something about Admiral Chen didn't add up, and he had a feeling that tomorrow would bring some answers to the questions that were keeping him awake. Jake Morrison woke before dawn, a habit developed over years of military service. The ship was quieter at this hour, with only the essential crew members moving through the corridors. He made his way to the mess hall for coffee and found Admiral Chen already there, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of black coffee and what appeared to be operational reports. What struck Jake immediately was how she looked. Gone was the perfectly pressed uniform from yesterday. She wore standard Navy fatigues that showed signs of actual use, not the pristine gear typically favored by visiting dignitaries. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail rather than the formal style she had worn for the official arrival. "Good morning, Lieutenant Commander," she said as Jake approached with his coffee. "Mind if I join you? I was hoping to ask you a few more questions before the live fire exercise." Jake sat down across from her, noting that she had chosen a table away from the handful of other early risers in the mess hall. "Of course, Admiral. What would you like to know?" Admiral Chen set down her coffee and looked at him directly. "I want to know about the missions you don't talk about in official reports. The ones where things went wrong, where the intel was bad, where you had to improvise because the plan fell apart." The question caught Jake off guard. Senior officers usually wanted to hear about successful missions and operational achievements. They rarely asked about failures or near disasters, especially not with such directness.
"Admiral, that's a pretty specific request."
"Most visiting officers prefer to hear about our successes, Kev." "I'm not most visiting officers," she replied with a slight smile. Success stories don't tell me what I need to know about your team's capabilities or the challenges you face. Failures and close calls are much more instructive. Jake studied her face, trying to read her motivations. Why do you want to know about our failures? Because that's where you learn the most about people. How they handle pressure, how they adapt when everything goes wrong, how they support each other when the mission is falling apart. She paused. And because that's where you find out whether the people making the plans have any idea what they're asking you to do. There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience rather than theoretical interest. Jake found himself reconsidering his initial assessment of Admiral Chen. The questions were too specific, too focused on operational realities that most senior officers never thought about. There was a mission about 2 years ago, Jake began cautiously, supposed to be a simple extraction of a high-value target from a compound in Afghanistan. Intel said minimal security, maybe 3 or 4 guards. Admiral Chen leaned forward slightly, her attention completely focused on his words. We went in expecting a quick operation. What we found was about 20 heavily armed fighters in a compound that looked nothing like the intelligence photos we'd been given. Jake took a sip of his coffee, remembering the chaos of that night. The whole mission went sideways in about 30 seconds. What did you do? We adapted. Martinez found an alternate extraction route while I kept the team together and focused on getting everyone out alive. We couldn't complete the primary objective, but we all came home. Jake looked at Admiral Chen carefully. The official report said the operation was a partial success. What it didn't say was that the intelligence failure nearly got my entire team killed. Admiral Chen nodded grimly. And I'm guessing the people who provided the bad intelligence never faced any consequences for nearly getting you killed. How did you know that? Because that's how it usually works. The people making the plans rarely have to deal with the consequences when those plans are wrong. There was a bitter edge to her voice that surprised Jake. Tell me, what would have been different if the person planning that mission had actually understood ground conditions? Jake thought for a moment. They would have known that the intelligence was questionable. They would have planned for contingencies. They would have given us the resources we needed instead of treating it like a simple snatch-and-grab operation. And people with operational experience would have caught those problems. Absolutely. Someone who had been in that situation before would have seen the red flags. Jake paused. Admiral, these are very specific questions. Most senior officers don't ask about intelligence failures and operational planning problems. Admiral Chen was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh her words. Lieutenant Commander, what would you say if I told you that I've been in situations where bad intelligence and poor planning nearly got people killed? I'd say that would be unusual for someone of your rank. Most admirals haven't been in direct combat situations. Most admirals haven't. But some have. She met his gaze directly. Some of us took a different path to get here. Before Jake could ask what she meant, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez appeared at their table. Excuse me, Admiral, Lieutenant Commander. Captain Williams asked me to inform you that the live fire exercise area is ready whenever you'd like to begin. Admiral Chen stood up. Thank you, Chief. We'll be right there. She turned to Jake. Shall we go see what your team can really do? The live fire exercise was set up in the ship's specialized training facility, which included a sophisticated shooting range capable of simulating various combat scenarios. Jake's team had prepared a demonstration that would showcase their marksmanship skills as well as their ability to work together under pressure. Admiral Chen took a position in the observation area, but Jake noticed she chose a spot that gave her a clear view of individual technique rather than just overall performance. Most visiting officers positioned themselves for the best photo opportunities or stayed far enough back to avoid any perceived danger. Begin when ready, Lieutenant Commander, Captain Williams called out. Jake signaled his team and they moved into the exercise with the precision that came from years of training together. The scenario involved engaging multiple targets while advancing through a complex course that required tactical movement and careful coordination. As his team worked through the drill, Jake found himself glancing at Admiral Chen. Unlike the previous day, when she had been observing their room-clearing technique, she now seemed to be evaluating specific aspects of their marksmanship and movement. Her eyes tracked their weapon handling, their communication patterns, and their individual shooting stances. Martinez engaged a series of targets from behind cover, his shots grouping tightly in the center mass area. Thompson, despite his relative inexperience, maintained good form and hit his assigned targets consistently. The rest of the team performed with their usual professionalism. But what caught Jake's attention was Admiral Chen's reaction to the exercise. She wasn't just watching passively like most observing officers, she was taking mental notes about specific techniques, and Jake could see her analyzing their procedures with the kind of detailed attention that suggested personal familiarity with the skills they were demonstrating. When the exercise concluded, Admiral Chen approached the team instead of waiting for them to come to her. She walked directly to Martinez, who had been handling the most challenging shooting positions. "Excellent grouping on those long-range targets, Petty Officer," she said. "What's your preferred sight picture for shots at that distance?" Martinez looked slightly surprised by the technical nature of the question. "Ma'am, I use a 6 o'clock hold with that particular optic setup. Gives me better consistency at range." Admiral Chen nodded. "Good choice. A lot of shooters try to use center hold at that distance and wonder why their groups open up." She turned to Thompson. "Seaman, I noticed you were having some trouble with the transition between targets. Have you tried adjusting your grip pressure during movement?" Thompson's eyes widened. "No, ma'am, I wasn't aware that grip pressure affected target transitions. It's a common issue. Too tight a grip during movement and you lose fluidity. Too loose and you lose control when you try to acquire the target quickly." She demonstrated the proper grip technique with practiced ease. "Try adjusting the pressure during your next training session and see if it helps." Jake found himself staring at Admiral Chen with growing confusion. The technical advice she was giving was sophisticated and accurate, the kind of knowledge that came from extensive personal experience with tactical shooting. It wasn't the sort of information that someone would pick up from briefing papers or administrative training. Captain Williams looked equally surprised by the detailed nature of Admiral Chen's feedback. "Admiral, you seem very familiar with these techniques." Admiral Chen smiled. "I've had some experience with tactical shooting over the years." She turned to Jake. "Lieutenant Commander, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They walked away from the group, and Admiral Chen led him to a quieter section of the deck. The morning sun was already heating up the Pacific, and Jake could see other ships in their task force maintaining formation in the distance. "I want to be honest with you about something," Admiral Chen began. "I haven't been completely forthright about my background, and I think it's time to clear the air." Jake felt his suspicions crystallizing. "What do you mean, Admiral?" "I mean that your instincts yesterday were partly right. I'm not a typical admiral who climbed the ranks through traditional channels." She paused. "But you were wrong about the kind of experience I've had." "I'm not sure I follow." Admiral Chen took a deep breath. "Lieutenant Commander, I was a Navy SEAL for 8 years before I moved into other roles within the military." Jake felt his world shift slightly. "You were a SEAL. Class 237, graduated 15 years ago. I spent my first 8 years in special operations before transitioning into intelligence and eventually strategic planning roles." She looked at him directly. "I know exactly what it feels like to be in a situation where the intelligence is wrong and the plan is falling apart because I've been there myself." The revelation explained so much about Admiral Chen's behavior. Her specific questions, her technical knowledge, her focus on operational realities rather than administrative details. But it also raised new questions. "Admiral, if you're a former SEAL, why didn't you mention that yesterday? Why let me think you were just another desk-bound administrator?" Admiral Chen smiled ruefully. "Because I wanted to see how you would react to what you thought was a typical visiting admiral. I wanted to understand your real feelings about the relationship between senior leadership and operational personnel." Jake felt a mixture of embarrassment and irritation. "So this whole thing has been some kind of test?" "Not a test exactly, more like reconnaissance." Admiral Chen's expression became more serious. "Lieutenant Commander, I'm not here for a routine inspection. I'm here because there are some significant changes coming to special operations, and I need to understand the current state of training and morale from people who will tell me the truth. What kind of changes? The kind that will affect how teams like yours are equipped, trained, and deployed. The kind that could make the difference between success and failure in future operations." She paused. and the kind that require input from people who actually understand what it's like to be shot at. Jake found himself reassessing everything about Admiral Chen. The knowledge she had demonstrated, the questions she had asked, the way she carried herself, it all made sense now. She wasn't a political appointee playing dress-up. She was someone who had walked the same path he was walking now. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because I need your help, and I need you to understand that when I ask for your honest opinion, I really mean it. Not the diplomatic version you'd give to a visiting administrator, but the real version you'd give to someone who's been in your boots." Jake studied her face, trying to process this new information. "What kind of help do you need?" "I need you to tell me what's really wrong with the current system, what resources you need that you're not getting, what training gaps exist that nobody wants to admit, what intelligence and planning failures are putting teams at risk." Admiral Chen looked out at the ocean for a moment. "And I need you to tell me honestly whether you think the people making strategic decisions really understand what they're asking you to do." This was the conversation Jake had been waiting years to have with someone in senior leadership. All the frustrations and concerns he had been discussing with his team, all the problems he had seen but felt powerless to address, Admiral Chen was asking him to put it all on the table. "Admiral, that's a very long list. I figured it would be, and I have time to hear all of it." She turned back to him. "But first, I need to know if you can trust me enough to give me the unfiltered version." Jake thought about the conversation they had just had, about the technical knowledge she had demonstrated, about the specific questions she had been asking. Everything about Admiral Chen made more sense now that he knew about her SEAL background. "I think I can," he said finally. "Good, because what I'm really here to investigate is whether the current command structure is putting teams like yours at unnecessary risk, and whether we need to make some fundamental changes to how special operations are managed." Before Jake could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Captain Williams and several other officers. "Admiral," the captain said, "we're ready for the next phase of your inspection whenever you'd like to proceed." Admiral Chen nodded. "Thank you, Captain. Lieutenant Commander Morrison and I were just finishing our discussion." She turned back to Jake. "Why don't we continue this conversation this evening? I'd like to hear those honest opinions we were talking about." As the group began moving toward the next scheduled activity, Jake found his mind racing. Everything he thought he knew about Admiral Chen had been wrong. She wasn't a political appointee or desk-bound administrator. She was someone who had been exactly where he was now. Someone who understood the realities of special operations from personal experience. The revelation changed everything about how he viewed her visit and her questions. Instead of another dog and pony show for a clueless senior officer, this was an opportunity to actually influence policy and procedures that affected teams like his. Martinez appeared at his side as they walked. "You look like someone just told you the ship was actually a submarine. What did Admiral Chen say to you?" Jake glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "She just told me something that explains a lot about why she's been asking such specific questions." "What kind of something?" "The kind that makes me think we might actually have an ally in senior leadership for the first time in years." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "That's pretty cryptic, even for you, but I can't really explain right now. Let's just say that Admiral Chen isn't what I thought she was." The rest of the morning was spent in more routine inspection activities. Admiral Chen observed various training exercises, reviewed equipment maintenance procedures, and conducted interviews with different members of the crew. But Jake noticed that her questions remained consistently focused on operational matters rather than administrative details. During lunch, Admiral Chen ate with various enlisted personnel rather than the senior officers' mess. Jake watched from across the mess hall as she engaged in what appeared to be genuine conversation with sailors from different departments. It was unusual behavior for a visiting admiral, but it made sense given what he now knew about her background. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself looking forward to their evening conversation with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. After years of feeling like his concerns and insights were falling on deaf ears, he was finally going to have a chance to speak honestly with someone who had the authority to actually make changes. But he was also aware that this conversation could be a career-defining moment. If Admiral Chen was really serious about wanting honest feedback, he was prepared to give it. But if this turned out to be some kind of elaborate trap, he could find himself in serious trouble for criticizing the command structure too openly. Around 1800 hours, Jake received word that Admiral Chen wanted to meet with him privately in one of the ship's conference rooms. He made his way through the corridors, mentally organizing the points he wanted to make. This might be his only opportunity to present his concerns to someone who could actually do something about them. Admiral Chen was already waiting when he arrived, sitting at a small table with a cup of coffee and a notebook. She had changed back into her working fatigues, and Jake noticed she looked more relaxed than she had during the formal inspection activities. "Lieutenant Commander, please sit down," she said. "I appreciate you taking the time for this conversation." Jake took a seat across from her. "Admiral, before we begin, I have to ask, is this conversation officially on the record?" Admiral Chen smiled.
That's a very smart question, and the answer is that it's completely off the record.
"I'm not here to create problems for anyone who gives me honest feedback. I'm here to gather information that will help me make better decisions." "All right. In that case, where would you like me to start?" "Start with whatever bothers you most about the current system. The thing that keeps you awake at night worrying about your team's safety or effectiveness." Jake didn't hesitate. "Intelligence failures. Over and over again, we're sent into situations based on incomplete or inaccurate information. And when things go wrong because the intelligence was bad, somehow it's never the fault of the people who provided the bad information." Admiral Chen made a note in her notebook. "How often would you say this happens?" "Often enough that I've started assuming any intelligence briefing is only about 50% accurate. We plan for contingencies that the official mission parameters don't even acknowledge might be necessary." Jake's frustration was evident in his voice. "And when we request better reconnaissance or more detailed intelligence, we're told it's not available or not necessary." What would better intelligence support look like from your perspective? Real-time updates during operations, better human intelligence sources, and most importantly, acknowledgement when intelligence is uncertain rather than pretending we know more than we actually do. Jake leaned forward. "Admiral, I'd rather go into a mission knowing we have limited information than go in thinking we have good information that turns out to be completely wrong." Admiral Chen nodded grimly. "I've been in that exact situation myself. It's terrifying to discover that everything you've been told about a mission is incorrect while you're taking fire." The confirmation that she really had experienced these problems firsthand made Jake more comfortable about expressing his concerns. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. And it's not just the intelligence problems. It's the way strategic decisions are made by people who have never been in a tactical situation." "Give me an example." Jake thought for a moment. "Last year, we were tasked with an operation that required extremely precise timing. The planners had designed a mission timeline that looked perfect on paper but didn't account for the realities of movement through difficult terrain with full combat loads." He shook his head. "When we pointed out that their timeline was unrealistic, we were told that the plan had been approved by senior leadership and couldn't be changed. What happened? We modified the plan during execution because the original timeline would have gotten us killed. The mission succeeded, but only because we ignored the official plan and did what actually made sense tactically." Admiral Chen made more notes. "And I'm guessing that kind of improvisation doesn't get reflected in the after-action reports." "Of course not. The official report says the mission was executed according to plan. There's no mention of the fact that we had to completely revise the approach during the operation, which means the people making future plans don't learn from the mistakes in previous plans." "Exactly. It's a cycle that just keeps repeating itself." Jake felt years of frustration pouring out. "Admiral, my team and I are good at what we do. We can adapt, improvise, and overcome obstacles. But we shouldn't have to overcome poor planning and bad intelligence every time we go out." Admiral Chen set down her pen and looked at him directly. "Lieutenant Commander, what you're describing is exactly why I'm here. The problems you've identified are not isolated to your team or even to this ship. They're systemic issues that are affecting special operations throughout the Navy. Are you saying these problems exist everywhere? I'm saying that every conversation I've had with operational personnel over the past 6 months has included the same concerns you just raised. Intelligence failures, unrealistic planning, lack of input from people with actual combat experience. Admiral Chen's expression was serious. And I'm here because some of us in senior leadership have finally decided to do something about it. Jake felt a flicker of hope. What kind of something? Changes to how intelligence is gathered and verified before operations, requirements for tactical input during the planning process, and accountability measures for when plans fail due to poor preparation rather than tactical circumstances. That sounds almost too good to be true. Admiral Chen smiled ruefully. It's going to be an uphill battle. There are a lot of entrenched interests that benefit from the current system. But there are also people in senior positions who understand that the current approach is putting good people at unnecessary risk. People like you? People like me. And hopefully people like you who are willing to help us make the case for change. Admiral Chen leaned back in her chair. Lieutenant Commander, I need people with operational experience who can articulate these problems clearly and suggest concrete solutions. Are you interested in being part of that process? Jake felt the conversation taking an unexpected turn. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking if you'd be interested in a temporary assignment that would allow you to work on these issues at the strategic level. A chance to help fix the problems instead of just dealing with their consequences. The offer was tempting, but also concerning. Admiral, I appreciate the opportunity, but my primary responsibility is to my team. I can't abandon them to chase after theoretical improvements to the system. I'm not asking you to abandon anything. What I'm proposing is a way for you to make sure other teams don't face the same problems yours has faced. Admiral Chen paused. Think about it this way. How many other lieutenant commanders out there are dealing with the same intelligence failures and planning problems you described? Jake knew the answer without having to think about it. Every SEAL team leader he knew had similar stories about missions that succeeded despite poor planning rather than because of good planning. What would this assignment involve? Working with a special task force that's reviewing current special operations procedures and making recommendations for improvements. Your job would be to provide the operational perspective that's been missing from too many strategic decisions. And my team would continue their normal duties under temporary leadership while you work on changes that could benefit not just them, but every special operations team in the Navy. Jake found himself genuinely considering the offer. After years of feeling powerless to address systemic problems, the opportunity to actually influence policy was compelling. But he also knew that temporary assignments had a way of becoming permanent, and he wasn't sure he was ready to leave operational service. Admiral, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you miss it? Being operational, I mean. Do you ever regret moving into strategic roles? Admiral Chen was quiet for a long moment. Every day, she said finally, there's nothing that compares to the brotherhood of an operational team and the satisfaction of successfully completing a difficult mission. She met his gaze. But I also know that the work I'm doing now has the potential to save lives and improve effectiveness for teams throughout the military. That's worth the sacrifice. How do you know you're actually making a difference? How do you know you're not just creating more bureaucracy? Because I stay connected to people like you who tell me the truth about what's working and what isn't. And because I judge success by whether operational conditions improve, not by whether my recommendations look good in briefing slides. Jake nodded, understanding her perspective. How much time do I have to think about this? Take whatever time you need, but don't take too long. The problems we've been discussing aren't getting any better while we debate solutions. As their conversation concluded, Jake found himself facing a decision he hadn't expected. The opportunity to help fix systemic problems was appealing, but it would mean leaving behind the work he loved and the team he had spent years building. Admiral Chen stood up and extended her hand. Lieutenant Commander, regardless of your decision about the assignment, I want to thank you for your honesty today. This conversation has been more valuable than any of the formal briefings I've received. Thank you for listening, Admiral. It's been a long time since I felt like someone in senior leadership actually cared about these issues. As Jake made his way back to his quarters, his mind was racing with the implications of their conversation. Admiral Chen had offered him a chance to influence the very problems he had been complaining about for years. But accepting would mean giving up his role as a team leader and entering the world of strategic planning that he had always viewed with skepticism. He found Martinez waiting for him with the inevitable questions about his extended meeting with Admiral Chen. But Jake wasn't ready to discuss the conversation or the offer he had received. He needed time to think about whether he was willing to trade his current role for the chance to make broader changes that might benefit other teams. As he lay in his bunk that night, Jake stared at the ceiling and wondered if Admiral Chen had made a similar decision years ago when she transitioned from operational service to strategic roles. Had she felt the same uncertainty about leaving her team behind? Had she doubted whether she could make a real difference from a position of senior leadership? Tomorrow, Admiral Chen would complete her inspection and return to her duties at headquarters, and Jake would have to decide whether he was ready to follow a similar path or remain with his team and continue dealing with the problems they both recognized, but only one of them had the opportunity to address. Jake Morrison barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself weighing Admiral Chen's offer against his loyalty to his team. By 0500 hours, he gave up trying to sleep and made his way to the deck to watch the sunrise over the Pacific. The morning was clear and calm, with just enough breeze to make the flag snap softly in the wind. He wasn't surprised to find Admiral Chen already there, standing at the railing with a cup of coffee in her hands. She looked like she had been up for a while, and Jake wondered if senior officers had trouble sleeping too. "Good morning, Lieutenant Commander," she said without turning around. "Beautiful morning." "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied, joining her at the railing. "Admiral, about our conversation last night." "You don't have to give me an answer yet," Admiral Chen interrupted gently. "I know it's a big decision. Actually, I do have some questions about the assignment you mentioned." Admiral Chen turned to face him. "Of course. What would you like to know? How long would it last, and would I have any guarantee of returning to operational service afterward?"
The initial assignment would be 6 months, with the possibility of extension if the work requires it.
"And yes, you would have a guarantee of returning to your current rank and position if you choose to do so."
Admiral Chen paused. "Jake, I want to be completely honest with you.
This kind of work can become addictive. Once you start seeing the big picture and understanding how policy decisions affect operational outcomes, some people find it hard to go back to purely tactical roles. Jake appreciated her honesty. "Is that what happened to you?" "Partly. I also realized that I could have more impact on special operations from a strategic position than I could as a team leader. But that doesn't mean it's the right choice for everyone." Before Jake could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Captain Williams and several other senior officers. "Admiral," the captain said, "your helicopter will be ready for departure in 30 minutes. Is there anything else you need to review before you leave?" Admiral Chen looked at Jake for a moment before responding. "Actually, Captain, there is one more thing I'd like to discuss with you and Lieutenant Commander Morrison." They made their way to Captain Williams' quarters, where Admiral Chen took a seat across from both men. Jake noticed she had brought her notebook from their conversation the previous evening. "Captain, I want to share some of my preliminary observations from this inspection," Admiral Chen began. "Overall, I'm very impressed with the quality of personnel and training aboard the Lincoln Canvas. Your special operations teams are clearly well prepared and highly skilled." Captain Williams looked pleased. "Thank you, Admiral. We take great pride in maintaining the highest standards." However, Admiral Chen continued, "My discussions with operational personnel have revealed some systemic issues that extend far beyond this ship or even this task force. Problems with intelligence support, strategic planning, and the integration of tactical experience into policy decisions." Jake watched Captain Williams' expression carefully. The captain was a good officer who genuinely cared about his crew, but he was also part of the system that Admiral Chen was critiquing. "What kind of problems, Admiral?" Captain Williams asked. the kind that force teams to improvise solutions to problems that should have been anticipated during the planning process, the kind that result from intelligence failures that could be prevented with better verification procedures. Admiral Chen looked directly at the captain. Captain, when was the last time you felt confident that a mission plan developed by higher headquarters would actually work as designed in the field? It was a pointed question that Captain Williams obviously hadn't expected. Jake could see him weighing his words carefully, trying to balance honesty with professional diplomacy. Admiral, I would say that most plans require some degree of adaptation during execution. That's the nature of military operations. I'm not talking about adaptation, Captain. I'm talking about plans that are fundamentally flawed because they were developed without adequate input from people who understand tactical realities. Admiral Chen's tone remained respectful but firm. Plans that fail not because of enemy action or unexpected circumstances, but because the planners didn't understand what they were asking operational personnel to do. Captain Williams glanced at Jake, perhaps wondering how much he had shared with Admiral Chen. Admiral, if there are specific concerns about our operational planning processes, I'd be happy to review them with my staff. Captain, the problems I'm describing aren't unique to your command. They exist throughout the special operations community, and they're the result of systemic issues that require attention at much higher levels than yours. Admiral Chen opened her notebook. That's why I'm recommending the establishment of a special task force to review and reform current procedures. Jake felt the conversation moving in the direction Admiral Chen had hinted at the night before. He could see that she was building a case for the kind of changes she had described, using his concerns as evidence for broader reforms. What would this task force involve? Captain Williams asked. A comprehensive review of intelligence procedures, planning processes, and training standards. But most importantly, it would include operational personnel who can provide perspective that's been missing from too many policy decisions. Admiral Chen looked at Jake. I believe Lieutenant Commander Morrison would be an excellent addition to such a task force. Captain Williams turned to look at Jake with surprise. Admiral, Morrison is one of my most experienced team leaders. His absence would significantly impact our operational readiness.
I understand that, Captain.
But his experience is exactly why he would be valuable for this assignment. And the improvements that could result would benefit not just your teams, but special operations personnel throughout the Navy. Jake found himself in the uncomfortable position of being discussed as if he weren't present. But he also recognized that Admiral Chen was making the case for his involvement in a way that Captain Williams would find difficult to oppose. Sir, Jake said, addressing Captain Williams directly. Admiral Chen has offered me a 6-month assignment with a guarantee of return to my current position. I believe it could be an opportunity to address some long-standing problems that affect teams like ours. Captain Williams studied Jake's face. Morrison, are you saying you want to take this assignment? Jake took a deep breath. Sir, I'm saying I think it could be worth doing if it might prevent other teams from facing the same problems we've dealt with. What problems are you referring to? This was the moment Jake had been dreading, having to articulate his concerns about the command structure in front of his commanding officer. But Admiral Chen's presence gave him confidence that his honesty wouldn't be held against him. Intelligence failure, sir. Planning processes that don't account for tactical realities. Lack of input from operational personnel when strategic decisions are made. Jake met Captain Williams's gaze directly. Problems that force us to improvise solutions during missions because the original plans weren't based on sufficient understanding of operational requirements. Captain Williams was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. Morrison, I can't say I disagree with your assessment. I've had similar concerns about some of the plans we've been asked to execute. Admiral Chen leaned forward. Captain, that's exactly why this task force is necessary. You and Lieutenant Commander Morrison aren't the only ones who have noticed these problems. But until now, there hasn't been a systematic effort to address them at the policy level. And you think Morrison's involvement would make a difference? I think Lieutenant Commander Morrison's experience and perspective could help ensure that future policies are grounded in operational reality rather than theoretical assumptions. Admiral Chen closed her notebook. Captain, I'm not trying to undermine your command or criticize your officers. I'm trying to fix problems that affect all of us. Captain Williams turned to Jake. Morrison, if you think this assignment could really make a difference, I won't stand in your way, but I want your word that you'll come back and put whatever you learn to use with your team. You have my word, sir. Admiral Chen stood up. Captain, I'll make sure Lieutenant Commander Morrison is properly prepared for this assignment and that his transition back to operational service is smooth. This isn't about pulling good officers away from their teams permanently. It's about making sure their expertise is used to improve conditions for everyone. As they prepared to leave Captain Williams's quarters, Admiral Chen asked to speak with Jake privately one more time. They stepped into an adjacent corridor where they could talk without being overheard. Jake, I want to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to, she said. This won't be easy work. You'll be dealing with entrenched bureaucracies, officers who have personal investments in the current system, and politicians who may not understand why changes are necessary.
Admiral, I've been dealing with the consequences of those bureaucracies and officers for 15 years.
At least now I'll have a chance to do something about it. Admiral Chen smiled. That's the right attitude. But I also want you to know that you'll have support. There are more people in senior leadership who share our concerns than you might think. We've just been waiting for the right opportunity to push for changes. When would this assignment begin? 2 weeks from today. That will give you time to brief your replacement and arrange for your team's transition. Admiral Chen paused. Jake, are you sure about this? Once you start seeing how decisions are really made at the strategic level, it's hard to go back to just following orders without question. Jake thought about his team, about all the missions where they had succeeded despite poor planning and bad intelligence. He thought about other teams facing the same problems, other leaders dealing with the same frustrations he had experienced. Admiral, if there's a chance to make things better for people like my team, I have to take it. Good. Then welcome to what will probably be the most frustrating and potentially the most important assignment of your career.
An hour later, Jake stood on the flight deck watching Admiral Chen's helicopter disappear into the distance.
The Lincoln was returning to its normal operation schedule, and most of the crew seemed relieved that the inspection was over. But Jake knew that for him, things were just beginning. Martinez found him standing at the railing, staring at the horizon. So, are you going to tell me what that was all about, or do I have to guess? Jake turned to face his longtime friend and colleague. Admiral Chen offered me a temporary assignment, 6 months working on a task force that's reviewing special operations procedures. And you said yes? I said yes, Martinez whistled softly. Jake, that's a big change. Are you sure you're ready for the world of staff officers and policy papers? No, Jake admitted, but I'm sure that I'm tired of dealing with the same problems over and over again without being able to fix them. What kind of problems? Jake looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then told Martinez about his conversations with Admiral Chen. He explained about her SEAL background, her understanding of operational challenges, and her commitment to addressing systemic problems that affected special operations teams throughout the Navy. So she's not what we thought she was, Martinez said when Jake finished. Not even close. She's someone who's been exactly where we are now, and she's in a position to actually make changes. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. You know, I had a feeling there was something different about her. The way she asked questions, the technical knowledge she had, it didn't match the typical Admiral profile. The question now is whether I can make a difference working with her task force, or if I'll just get lost in the bureaucracy. Jake, if anyone can navigate that world without losing sight of what's important, it's you. And if you can help fix even some of the problems we've dealt with, it'll be worth it. That evening, Jake called his team together for a meeting. He explained that he would be taking a temporary assignment and that Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez would be taking over as acting team leader during his absence. Sir? Thompson said, does this mean you're leaving us permanently? No, Thompson. I'll be back in 6 months, assuming I don't screw anything up too badly while I'm gone. Jake looked around the table at the faces of men he had worked with for years. But while I'm away, I want you to remember everything we've talked about regarding planning problems and intelligence failures. Keep track of the issues you encounter because when I get back, I want to know whether the work we're doing actually makes a difference. What kind of work will you be doing? Rodriguez asked, trying to fix the problems that force us to improvise our way through missions because the original plans were developed by people who have never been shot at. The team exchanged glances, understanding immediately what Jake was referring to. They had all been in situations where poor planning or bad intelligence had complicated their missions unnecessarily. Sir, Martinez said, if you can actually make progress on those issues, it would be the best thing that's happened to special operations in years. 3 weeks later, Jake found himself in a conference room at the Pentagon surrounded by officers from various services and civilian analysts. Admiral Chen sat at the head of the table, leading a discussion about intelligence verification procedures that would have seemed impossibly theoretical just a month earlier. But as Jake listened to the conversation, he began to understand how policy decisions were made and why operational concerns often got lost in the process. Most of the people in the room were intelligent and well-intentioned, but few of them had the kind of tactical experience that would help them understand the practical implications of their recommendations. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, Admiral Chen said, turning to him during a discussion about mission planning timelines, you've had extensive experience with rapid deployment operations. What's your assessment of the current planning process for time-sensitive missions? Jake looked around the table at the faces watching him expectantly. A month ago, he would have been intimidated by the setting and the rank of the people present. Now, he realized that his perspective was exactly what was missing from these discussions. Admiral, the current process assumes that planning can be done in a controlled environment with complete information and unlimited time for coordination. In reality, most of our missions require decisions based on incomplete intelligence and implementation under significant time pressure. A Navy captain across the table frowned. Lieutenant Commander, surely you're not suggesting that we should abandon thorough planning procedures? No, sir. I'm suggesting that our planning procedures should account for the reality that most operational situations don't provide the luxury of complete information or unlimited time. Jake felt more confident as he continued. We need planning processes that are robust enough to work when conditions change, not just when everything goes according to the original assumptions. Admiral Chen nodded approvingly. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the aircraft carrier's deck, watching the morning sun paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and orange. His weathered hands gripped the railing as he breathed in the salt air that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. After 15 years as a Navy SEAL, Jake thought he had seen everything the military could throw at him. The USS Abraham Lincoln was buzzing with unusual activity that morning. Word had spread through the ship like wildfire that a new admiral would be coming aboard for an inspection. Jake couldn't help but smirk at the thought. He had dealt with plenty of high-ranking officers over the years, and most of them were the same old men in pressed uniforms who had forgotten what it felt like to have sand between their toes and enemy fire overhead. Morrison, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez called out from across the deck. Captain wants to see you in the briefing room. Something about the new admiral's visit. Jake nodded and made his way through the narrow corridors of the massive ship. The Lincoln was home to over 5,000 sailors, and it seemed like every one of them was preparing for this mysterious admiral's arrival. Jake had to admit he was curious, but he wasn't about to lose sleep over another dog and pony show. The briefing room was packed with officers when Jake arrived. Captain Williams stood at the front, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like nervousness. Jake had never seen the captain rattled by anything, not even during their deployment in the Middle East, where they had faced constant threats. "Listen up, everyone," Captain Williams began, his voice carrying across the room. "We're receiving a very important visitor today. The new admiral will be conducting a comprehensive review of our operations, particularly our Special Forces units. Admiral Chen proved to be an effective advocate for the changes they developed, using her position and credibility to push through reforms that might otherwise have been blocked by institutional resistance." Jake came to understand why she had found the strategic role rewarding despite the frustrations. The potential impact of policy changes was enormous compared to what could be accomplished at the tactical level, but he also understood why she missed operational service. There was something irreplaceable about the immediate, tangible nature of tactical success. Policy work required faith that changes would eventually translate into better conditions for operational personnel, but the results were often invisible to the people making them. As his 6-month assignment neared its end, Jake faced a decision he hadn't fully anticipated. Admiral Chen offered him a permanent position with the task force, with the opportunity to continue working on special operations reform and eventually move into senior leadership roles himself. "Jake," she said during one of their final meetings, "you've made a real difference here. The changes we've implemented will affect how special operations are conducted throughout the Navy. Are you sure you want to go back to purely operational service?" Jake looked out the window of the Pentagon conference room at the Washington skyline. It was a long way from the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, both literally and figuratively. "Admiral, I appreciate the offer, and I've learned more in the past 6 months than I thought possible. But my team is waiting for me, and I made a commitment to bring back what I've learned and put it to use at the operational level." Admiral Chen smiled. "I thought you might say that. But Jake, this isn't the end of your involvement in these issues. We're going to need people like you to help implement these changes and provide feedback on how they work in practice. I'll be happy to help with that." "Good. And Jake, don't be surprised if you find yourself missing this work. The problems we've been addressing don't go away just because you return to your team." 2 weeks later, Jake stood on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln again, watching the sunset over the Pacific. His team had welcomed him back enthusiastically, and he was in the process of resuming his role as their leader. But Admiral Chen had been right. He found himself seeing everything differently now. He understood the sources of the problems they faced, the organizational dynamics that created intelligence failures and planning gaps. More importantly, he knew that changes were being implemented that could prevent some of those problems in the future. Martinez joined him at the railing, just as he had on Jake's first night back aboard ship. "So how does it feel to be back in the real Navy?" Jake laughed. "It feels good. But I have to admit, Admiral Chen was right about one thing. Once you understand how decisions are made at the strategic level, it's hard to just follow orders without thinking about the bigger picture."
Any regrets about coming back?
Jake thought about the question carefully. "No regrets about coming back. But I do feel a responsibility to make sure the changes we worked on actually make a difference for teams like ours. And if they don't, then I'll probably find myself back in Washington at some point trying to fix whatever we got wrong this time." Martinez nodded. "You know, when Admiral Chen first arrived, I thought you were being too hard on her. But I also thought she was just another desk jockey. We were both wrong, weren't we?" "Yeah," Jake said, remembering his initial skepticism and confident dismissal of Admiral Chen's experience. "We were both wrong. Sometimes the people in charge actually do understand what it's like to be in our position." "Think we'll see her again?" Jake smiled, thinking about Admiral Chen's commitment to staying connected with operational personnel and her promise that their work together wasn't finished. "I have a feeling we will." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake reflected on the journey that had started with Admiral Chen's unexpected arrival just 6 months earlier. He had learned that his assumptions about senior leadership were often wrong, that change was possible even in large bureaucratic organizations, and that his experience as an operational leader could have value far beyond his immediate team. Most importantly, he had learned that the military was full of people like Admiral Chen. Individuals who had chosen to take on the frustrating work of strategic leadership because they understood that somebody had to bridge the gap between policy and practice. Jake Morrison was back where he belonged, leading his team and preparing for whatever missions awaited them. But he was also part of something larger now, a network of operational and strategic leaders working to ensure that the next generation of special operations personnel would face fewer of the systemic problems that had challenged his generation. And somewhere in Washington, Admiral Sarah Chen was probably preparing for another inspection visit, ready to ask the kind of direct questions that would make another confident SEAL realize that his assumptions about senior leadership might be completely wrong. Jake leaned back in his chair, already mentally preparing for the usual routine. He would shake hands, answer a few questions about mission readiness, and then get back to real work. These inspections were always the same. A bunch of paperwork pushers trying to look important while the real warriors did the heavy lifting. "Sir," Lieutenant Patterson raised her hand, "do we know anything about this Admiral's background? It might help us prepare for the specific areas they'll want to focus on." Captain Williams paused, shuffling through his papers. "The personnel file is limited. What I can tell you is that this officer has an exceptional record and has been fast-tracked through several promotions. The promotion to Admiral came through just last week." Jake rolled his eyes. Fast-track promotions usually meant political connections rather than real experience. He had seen too many officers who knew how to play the game but had never faced real danger, the kind who made decisions from comfortable offices while soldiers like him risked their lives to carry them out. "The Admiral will be arriving by helicopter at 1400 hours, the captain continued. "I want everyone on their best behavior. This inspection could have significant implications for our unit's future assignments and resources."
After the briefing, Jake made his way to the mess hall where his team was already gathered around their usual table.
Petty Officer First Class Martinez was telling one of his infamous stories about a mission in Afghanistan, while Seaman Thompson hung on every word like it was the gospel truth. "Hey, Jake," Martinez called out as he approached. "Heard we're getting a visit from some hotshot Admiral. Think they'll want to see us in action?" Jake grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down heavily. "Probably just another desk jockey looking to add some combat unit photos to their promotion portfolio. We'll smile, nod, answer their questions, and then they'll fly away in their comfortable helicopter back to their air-conditioned office." Thompson, who was still relatively new to the team, looked confused. "But aren't admirals supposed to be really experienced? I mean, you don't get to that rank without proving yourself, right?" The older members of the team exchanged knowing looks. Jake patted the young seaman on the shoulder. "Kid, you've got a lot to learn about how the military really works. Sure, some admirals earned their stars the hard way, but plenty of others got there by knowing the right people and staying away from anything that might mess up their perfect record." "Come on, Jake," Martinez said. "You're being pretty harsh. This new admiral might surprise you." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Martinez, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've met dozens of admirals, generals, and other high-ranking officers. The ones who actually understand what we do are few and far between. Most of them see us as just another asset on a spreadsheet." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the ship's intercom. "All personnel prepare for VIP arrival. Admiral's helicopter inbound, ETA 15 minutes. Jake finished his coffee and stood up. "Well, gentlemen, time to put on our best faces and pretend we're impressed by whatever ribbon-heavy uniform walks through that door." The team made their way to the flight deck where most of the ship's senior staff had already assembled. Jake positioned himself near the back of the group, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid unnecessary interaction. He watched as sailors scurried around, making last-minute preparations for the helicopter landing. The sound of rotor blades grew louder as a Navy helicopter approached the ship. "Can you give us a specific example of how current procedures could be improved?" Jake thought about the mission he had described to Admiral Chen aboard the Lincoln, the intelligence failure that had nearly gotten his team killed. Intelligence briefings should include confidence levels for different pieces of information, and plans should include contingencies for scenarios where key intelligence assumptions prove incorrect. "That makes sense," said a Marine colonel who had been quietly taking notes. "We've had similar experiences where intelligence certainty was overstated and operational plans didn't account for the possibility of significant variances from expectations." As the discussion continued, Jake realized that Admiral Chen had been right about the potential impact of including operational personnel in policy discussions. The problems he had thought were unique to his team were actually widespread, and addressing them systematically could benefit special operations forces throughout the military. Over the following months, Jake threw himself into the work with the same intensity he had brought to operational missions. He reviewed after-action reports, interviewed team leaders from different services, and helped develop new procedures for intelligence verification and mission planning. The work was often frustrating, involving long meetings with people who seemed more concerned with protecting their organizational interests than solving operational problems. But gradually, Jake began to see progress. New requirements for tactical input during planning processes, improved procedures for assessing intelligence reliability, training programs that brought operational experience to staff officers who had never served in combat roles. Jake had to admit the pilot was skilled, bringing the aircraft down smoothly despite the crosswinds that were common in this part of the Pacific. The helicopter touched down with precision, and Jake found himself wondering if the Admiral had demanded such careful handling or if the pilot was just showing off. As the rotor blades began to slow, Jake crossed his arms and prepared himself for the usual routine. He imagined an older man, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and a chest full of medals that represented more time behind a desk than in actual combat. The type who would ask scripted questions and nod thoughtfully at responses he didn't really understand. The helicopter door opened and Jake watched with mild interest as the figure inside prepared to emerge. He was already planning his responses to the typical questions: how long have you been with the SEALs? What's your unit's current readiness level? Any operational concerns I should be aware of? What he wasn't prepared for was what happened next. A woman stepped out of the helicopter. Jake blinked, thinking perhaps she was an aide or assistant who had come ahead of the Admiral. But as she moved closer, he could see the unmistakable rank insignia on her uniform. 4 stars gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. She was tall and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation style, and her uniform was perfectly pressed but showed subtle signs of actual wear rather than the pristine condition typical of officers who never left their offices. Jake estimated she was probably in her early 40s, which seemed impossibly young for an admiral. Captain Williams stepped forward to greet her, his salute crisp and respectful. "Admiral, welcome aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln." "I'm Captain Williams, commanding officer." "Thank you, Captain," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the deck despite the residual noise from the helicopter. "I'm Admiral Sarah Chen. I appreciate you taking the time to arrange this inspection." Jake felt his confident smirk falter slightly. The woman's voice had an authority that seemed natural rather than forced, and her handshake with the captain looked firm and genuine. Still, he reminded himself that appearances could be deceiving. Plenty of officers knew how to put on a good show. As Admiral Chen began making her way down the line of assembled officers, Jake straightened up slightly but maintained his skeptical attitude. He had learned long ago not to be impressed by rank alone. What mattered was whether this admiral understood the realities of military operations or if she was just another political appointee playing dress-up in a uniform. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison," Captain Williams called out as the Admiral approached, "I'd like you to meet our senior SEAL team leader. Morrison has 15 years of experience in special operations." Admiral Chen extended her hand to Jake with a smile that seemed genuine rather than the practiced politician's grin he expected. "Lieutenant Commander, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard excellent things about your team's performance." Jake shook her hand, noting that her grip was firm without being unnecessarily aggressive. "Thank you, Admiral. We do our best to stay mission-ready." "I'm sure you do," she replied. "I'm particularly interested in learning about your recent training exercises. I understand your team has been working on some innovative approach techniques." Jake was slightly surprised that she seemed to know specific details about their operations, but he kept his expression neutral. "Yes, ma'am. We've been adapting our insertion methods based on lessons learned from recent deployments." Admiral Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Adaptation is crucial in special operations. The enemy doesn't stay static, so neither can we. I'd like to hear more about these innovations during our discussion later." As she moved on to greet other officers, Jake found himself studying her more carefully. There was something in her manner that seemed different from the typical high-ranking officer. She asked follow-up questions that suggested she actually understood the answers, and her comments indicated familiarity with operational details that desk-bound officers usually didn't possess. Still, Jake reminded himself that some politicians were very good at doing their homework before important meetings. It was entirely possible that Admiral Chen had been thoroughly briefed by her staff and was simply good at reciting information that had been prepared for her. The formal greetings concluded, and Captain Williams began leading Admiral Chen on a tour of the ship. Jake and his team were instructed to return to their normal duties and prepare for a more detailed briefing later in the afternoon. "What did you think?" Martinez asked as they walked away from the flight deck. Jake shrugged. "Too early to tell. She seems more prepared than most, but that could just mean she has better staff officers writing her briefing notes." Thompson, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, shook his head. "I don't know, Jake. She seemed pretty confident. And did you notice she didn't have any aides whispering in her ear? Most of the high-ranking officers I've seen always have someone telling them what to say." "The kid has a point," Martinez added. "Plus, she's pretty young for an admiral. You don't get promoted that fast unless you've done something seriously impressive." Jake remained unconvinced. "Or unless you have seriously impressive connections. Look, I'm not saying she's incompetent. I'm just saying I'll believe she is the real deal when I see some evidence of it. Talk is cheap, even when it comes from someone with 4 stars." The team spent the next few hours going through their normal training routine. Jake led them through a series of combat drills focusing on close-quarters battle techniques and tactical movement. It was the kind of work that had become second nature to him after years of practice. But he never allowed his team to get complacent. As they worked, Jake couldn't help but think about Admiral Chen. Something about her had seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have encountered her before. Her manner of speaking, the way she carried herself, even the specific questions she had asked, it all suggested a level of experience that seemed unusual for someone who had presumably spent most of her career climbing the administrative ladder. Around 1600 hours, word came down that Admiral Chen wanted to observe some training exercises. Jake assembled his team in the ship's combat training facility, a specialized area designed to simulate various operational environments. They had been told to conduct a standard room-clearing drill while the Admiral observed. Jake positioned his team at the entrance to the mock structure, reviewing hand signals and entry procedures. It was routine work, but he insisted on treating every drill as if it were a real mission. Sloppy training led to deadly mistakes when the bullets started flying for real. Admiral Chen entered the observation area accompanied by Captain Williams and a few other senior officers. She took a position where she could clearly see the exercise but remained far enough back to avoid interfering with the drill. "Begin when ready, Lieutenant Commander," Captain Williams called out. Jake signaled his team, and they moved into action with the fluid precision that came from years of working together. Martinez took point, Thompson covered the rear, and the others flowed through the structure with practiced efficiency. They cleared each room methodically, communicating through subtle hand signals and covering each other's movements. As they worked their way through the exercise, Jake noticed Admiral Chen watching intently. Unlike most observing officers who usually seemed more interested in looking important than actually paying attention, she appeared to be studying every aspect of their technique. Her eyes tracked their movement patterns, and Jake could see her making mental notes about their procedures. The drill concluded without any major issues, though Jake made a mental note to work with Thompson on his corner clearing technique. The young seaman was improving rapidly, but he still had a tendency to expose himself unnecessarily when rounding tight angles. "Excellent work," Admiral Chen said as the team gathered their equipment. "That was some very smooth coordination." "Thank you, ma'am," Jake replied. "We've been working together as a unit for several years now. That kind of familiarity makes a big difference in high-stress situations." Admiral Chen nodded. "Absolutely. Individual skill is important, but unit cohesion is what wins missions. How often do you train in live-fire scenarios?" The question caught Jake slightly off guard. Most visiting officers asked about training schedules or equipment maintenance. Questions about live-fire exercises suggested a more practical understanding of operational requirements. "We try to get to the range at least twice a week, ma'am. Live-fire drills help maintain our edge and identify any issues with equipment or technique." "Good," Admiral Chen said. "I'd like to see one of those exercises if possible. Perhaps tomorrow morning?" Captain Williams looked slightly surprised. "Of course, Admiral. We can arrange whatever you'd like to observe." The SEAL smiled confidently. never realizing she was the newly appointed admiral. Emotional stories.